This episode of Lex Out Loud is brought to you by the patrons of Starwalker Studios. Learn how you can support the show at lexstarwalker.com/support. Hello and welcome to episode 45 of Lex Out Loud, writing science fiction. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. This is a podcast for writers, readers, and all lovers of speculative fiction. I'm writing my third novel and taking you along for the ride. Today, I want to talk a little bit about pacing. I'd like to share some observations I've made of a lot of books I've read, how they gradually increase momentum as the book progresses. But before we start talking about pacing and momentum, I like to share with you at the top of the show what I'm reading and what I'm watching that I'm enjoying right now. So as far as books I'm reading, I'm actually reading two books right now. They're both Stephen King books. One I'm reading and I actually just finished, and the other one I'm listening to on the audiobook. I'm listening to the audiobook, if I could talk straight. So I just actually finished the book Elevation by Stephen King, which I really enjoyed. It's a pretty short book. I read it in like 2 evenings. So, if you're looking for a short, quick read, it's a good one. And I really enjoyed it. It was a really, really great story and highly recommend it. And I just started the audio version of Desperation by Stephen King, which is an older book of his. I think it was published in 1997, I think. And I was actually recommended this book by my barber. So yeah, I wanted to check it out, and it's really cool because the audio version of the book is read by Stephen King himself. So if you're looking for a good audiobook, I recommend it. I'm only a couple chapters into it, but so far it's good. It's got me hooked already. I will say it's a pretty dark book already, but I mean, if you've ever read Stephen King, then you probably are expecting that anyway. The book I just talked about, Elevation, is not a dark book at all. So it's very different from a lot of his books. It's not at all a horror book or anything like that. But Desperation is pretty dark. I'm thinking it's probably going to be a horror book, but yeah, I'm enjoying the audio version read by Stephen King himself. And if you'd like to listen to the audio version, you can get a free 30-day trial to Audible books, courtesy of Lex Out Loud. You can head to audibletrial.com/LOL and get your free 30-day trial and help me out in the process. If you would like to read either physical versions or ebook versions of either of these books, I will have links to them on Amazon on my website in the show notes for this episode at lexstarwalker.com/LOL. As far as what I'm watching right now, I am super excited because as of recording this, the Wheel of Time TV series on Amazon Prime is finally out. I actually checked around 9:00 last night. I'm recording this on November 19th, which is the day it was supposed to come out. But I live in the Pacific Northwest, so I'm Pacific time. And a lot of times here in the US, when things release, they release based on Eastern time, which is 3 hours ahead of me. So it was around 9:00 last night, and it occurred to me that it was now midnight Eastern time, which meant that it was now the 19th of November on the East Coast. And a lot of times with digital streaming platforms like Netflix or Amazon or whatever, a lot of times when they release new shows, they release them at midnight. So I was like, oh, I might be able to watch this now. And so I went on Amazon Prime, and sure enough, the first episode was out. And by the time I had finished the first episode, the next 2 episodes were out. So they're releasing the first 3 episodes right away on November 19th. And I'm still 2 or 3 weeks ahead in my production, I think. So by the time you hear this, unless you're a patron, patrons hear the episodes a lot sooner. But for most of you, by the time you hear this, there will probably be 5 or 6 episodes out by now, I think. But that's on Amazon Prime. So if you have Amazon Prime, you can watch it there. And as of recording this, I've seen the first 2 episodes, and they were fantastic. I mean, honestly, everything about it is fantastic. The acting is phenomenal. The sets and the scenery, it's just gorgeous. The costuming's fantastic. The special effects are amazing. The Trollocs are truly scary and horrifying. And my wife and I were talking about it last night about how, the Trollocs in the Wheel of Time on this show are just scary on a whole nother level than the orcs in the Lord of the Rings ever were. Even in the Lord of the Rings movies, which were really good, the orcs weren't really that scary, or at least aren't as scary as Trollocs are. But the Trollocs they're so big and they're so ridiculously strong and fast and just beyond humans in their physical abilities that they're quite terrifying. And add to that they're actually pretty intelligent, which is obvious in the show, much more intelligent than the orcs in the Lord of the Rings movies seem to be. So yeah, they're pretty scary. And it was just really well done. I'm planning to watch the 3rd episode tonight. I'm really looking forward to it. Now, I will say, if you are a fan of the books, there are a lot of changes between, how the books are and how the show is. And, that's just a necessary thing. The Wheel of Time series is 14 novels long, 15 if you count the prequel novel. And most of those novels are huge doorstop fantasy novels. I don't know what the word counts are, but some of the hardbacks are over 1,000 pages. I mean, they're huge. So there's just no way that you could make these novels into a TV show and get to the end of the story just doing it, just recreating what's in the novels. It's just impossible. There's no way. Add to that the fact that they only have 8-episode seasons, which is those decisions are made by the powers that be. For in this case at Amazon Prime, they're not made by the showrunner. So the showrunner, whose name is Rafe Lee Judkins, if I'm remembering right, he's done the best that he can with the situation that he was given. And another aspect of this is these books were written quite a while ago. The first book, I think, was published in the 90s. So that's 30 years ago now. So what was at the time extremely progressive would now, if they did things just the way they did it in the book, would seem a little not progressive, a little backwards, a little behind the times. So every change that I saw, and I'm someone who has read the books many, many times, so I was aware of everything that was even slightly different from the books, whether it was in the costumes or the characters or the setting or whatever. At least to me, every change that I saw, it was immediately obvious why the change was made. And I think it was a change that needed to be made. And I'm very pleased with how they're approaching it. So there are certain adaptations of books that are just very true to the book. And it's almost just like seeing the book on the screen, scene for scene. And, those are great. But then there are some adaptations where it's its own thing, whether it's a movie or it's a TV series. It's based on a book or a series of books, but it's its own thing, and you have to approach it that way. And these is one of this. My God, if I could talk, this series is one of the latter types. It's not just a recreation of the books, scene for scene. Things are being introduced in a different order. There's already been one new character that was introduced. There's already been one major character, well, actually 2 major characters that I can think of that have been skipped that were introduced by now at this point in the books. One of them I know for sure is going to be in the show, and that's Tom Maryland, because he was cast. The other one I'm not sure about. I think it might be a character that they just got rid of for probably quite a few good reasons. But anyway, if you are a fan of the book, I would just really encourage you to go into this with an open mind and just go into it understanding that it's not just a recreation of the books. It's its own thing based on the books. And I think it is going to catch or capture the heart and the spirit of the books, but it's not going to be a scene for scene, character to character recreation. One of the big changes, it's apparent from the very beginning, is the main characters, at least the main characters at the beginning of the first book, are quite a bit older. In the books, they're, 17, 18 years old. And in the show, they're around 25 years old. And with all the, everything that comes with that. So a lot of the things are different. For instance, when they're in Shadar Logoth, things just play out a bit differently because these people aren't kids in the show. So the way they behave in the books as 17, 18-year-olds just wouldn't be appropriate for 25-year-olds. A lot of the main beats are the same, but the way we get there is a little different. And, there's a lot of stuff that's skipped just by necessity. Because again, the book series is huge and there's no way you could just translate that to TV. But I was really, just in the first 2 episodes, I was really impressed with how much was in there. There was actually more of material from the Eye of the World in just those 2 episodes than I was expecting. There were things that I thought they would kind of skip that they didn't, that they got in there. So that was really cool. So I am someone that I was a little, I don't know what the word is, not scared, but I was a little leery about this. I was a little worried about how it would be and if it would really be satisfying and if I would really like it as a fan of the books. And so far, I love everything they're doing and I can't wait to see more. So whether or not you've read the books, I highly recommend it. Check it out. And another thing I wanted to mention, because I've read a lot of interviews with Rafe Judkins about the showrunner about this. And one of the things he brought up that I hadn't thought of until I read it was, they have to sometimes do things differently because although the Wheel of Time, the books were written before Game of Thrones, the show Game of Thrones obviously came out before the Wheel of Time. So there's this interesting reality where there are things that the Game of Thrones did that was actually done first in the Wheel of Time, and the Game of Thrones was riffing on or borrowing from the Wheel of Time, but then Game of Thrones, the TV show, happened first. So if Wheel of Time does those things now, it's going to seem to people who haven't read the books like Wheel of Time is copying Game of Thrones, when in reality, Game of Thrones copied the Wheel of Time, which is really interesting. So that kind of, they had to keep that in mind too, because they can't have the show just look like it's copying Game of Thrones, even though the Wheel of Time material came out before. So it's kind of interesting. So yeah, check it out, and I think you'll enjoy it. I wanted to also let you know today that I am getting back into blogging again. As of recording this, I just wrote a new blog post on my blog. So yeah, I'm going to try to do new blog posts about once a week and just get that going again. It's been quite a while since I've written blog posts. The last time I was really posting much on the blog, a lot of it was tabletop RPG related. And, I'm just going to blog about whatever I feel like blogging about, but probably a lot of it will be material or topics similar to what, or even the same as what I talk about here on the show. So it's going to be probably a lot of writing related stuff, but I don't know, I may do some other things as well, but I've started making a list of ideas of blog posts I could write. And so far, most of, or all of them have been writing topics and just, what I'm doing as a writer. So yeah, if you like reading blogs, check that out at lexstarwalker.com/blog. All right. So I wanted to talk today about momentum in books and in more general in stories, but I'm really talking about novels here today because that's what I do. And, I'm not, like everything I do in this show, I'm not claiming that this is new or original, or I'm the first person to think of these things. Obviously, that is not the case. But I thought it would be fun to talk about today because what I'm talking about today is not something I've learned from hearing a lecture or a talk by a writer or an interview with a writer. This isn't something where I've heard some published writer talk about how they do what they do. This is something I've learned just from reading as a reader, just reading books. And I don't know, I've been kicking around the idea for this episode for a few months now, I think. But it was a few months ago that I suddenly noticed this trend in a lot or even all of the really good books I was reading as far as how they're paced and how they have this increasing momentum and kind of how the writer seems to be doing that. And again, this just came from me observing what I was reading and books that I was reading and thinking about what they were doing and how they were doing it. And I thought it would be really interesting to talk about because as a writer, honestly, if you're going to ask me what's the best thing I can do to become a better writer, I would say read a lot. And by read a lot, I'm not saying go read a lot of blog articles by writers about how to write. I'm not saying go read a lot of books about writing like Stephen King's On Writing, although that's a fantastic book to read about writing. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying go read books of the type that you want to write. So if you're like me and you want to write science fiction, go read as many science fiction books as you can. That's the number one thing you can do to become a better writer and to, I think, better your odds of becoming a published writer. You know, I mean, if you just want to be a better writer in general, you know, go read all the books you can read, period. Go read, you know, if you want to write fiction, go read every fiction book you can get your hands on, and go as wide as possible. But if you're a little more focused on getting published and you know what genre or subgenre you want to write, then I would recommend reading as many of those books as possible, because not only will you learn how to be a better writer, but you'll learn how to write the kind of books you want to write and what that market is like. So if you're like me and you're wanting to write science fiction, even, you know, be as specific as you can, mundane science fiction, which is what I'm writing, then read as many mundane science fiction books as you can, focusing a bit more on recent books, but also reading, you know, the gamut as far as the history of mundane science fiction so that you can get a feeling for what is the market like right now, which is to say, in your genre, let's say mundane science fiction, what kind of books are being published now that are mundane science fiction? What are they like? What kind of stories are they telling? How are they telling them? And also the history. You know, what kind of mundane science fiction books have been published before? What's been done? You know, what tropes and themes have been done to the point where, you know, we don't see those anymore because they've been done enough? What tropes and themes have been done but are still being done and aren't worn out yet? So, you know, if you're serious about publishing, that's a great way to start to get an idea of, you know, what kind of books are being published right now. And if you can write a book that fits in that, then that'll help, or avoid, you know, if there are certain tropes or ideas in your genre that have just been done to death and nobody wants to see them anymore, you know, you can avoid doing that. Because, you know, if you write a book that's very heavily steeped in tropes and cliches that everybody's sick of, your odds of getting that book published are pretty much zero, probably. But just in general, a great way to learn to be a better writer is to read a lot. And speaking of On Writing by Stephen King, he recommends this in that book. And I think he even gives, I don't know, something like 4 to 6 hours a day he recommends reading. But as much time as you spend writing, you should spend significantly more time reading, because that's really how we learn. And, you know, there are a lot of things that really great writers do and how they do them that they can't necessarily tell you about. They can't necessarily explain. They may not even necessarily understand themselves exactly what they're doing or how they're doing it. A lot of writing is kind of instinctual. You just do it. And there are a lot of writers that can't at all explain how they do what they do. It's kind of, the special writers that are also good teachers who can explain to you exactly how they're doing what they're doing. I think, for instance, Brandon Sanderson is a writer like that. Not only is he a good writer, but he's really good at being able to explain how he does what he does and why. So he's a great teacher of writing, especially for people that want to write like he does or want to write the kinds of things he does, because he can oftentimes tell you how he's doing what he's doing and why. But a lot of writers can't do that, or they can only do that to a certain degree. And even Brandon Sanderson probably can't explain every nuance of every little thing that he does, because some of it is subconscious or instinctual, or however you want to put it. It's not something you're necessarily thinking about consciously or even aware of consciously. So those kinds of things, really the only way to learn them is to just pick them up by reading, and reading a lot over a long period of time. And then you just start to notice things. And again, you may not notice these things consciously. You may not be able to explain them to someone else, but you start to pick up on them and you start to do them in your own writing. A lot of this, or this is a lot of what people talk about as finding your voice. I mean, that's kind of what that is. Nobody can really explain how to have a voice or how to do that. That's a perfect example of something that writers can't really explain to another writer, like how to find your voice. Usually the advice for finding your voice is to read a lot and write a lot and just be patient, and it will develop over time. But what's happening there is you are absorbing things from the books that you read and the writers that you read, and picking up techniques that you see them doing that you like, that work for you, and learning to do that yourself in your own way. And those kinds of things are hard or even impossible to teach. The only way to learn them is by reading. So this, what I'm talking about with momentum today, this is a thing like that I've learned just by reading. So I thought it'd be fun to talk about it, because I really kind of had a eureka moment a few months ago when I realized how many books are doing this and kind of how it works. And now this is another tool in my toolbox that I can use when I'm writing my books. Now, I think oftentimes the case with things like this is when you notice these things or realize these things, or someone points one of these things out to you, it suddenly seems very obvious. And yet before that moment, you never noticed it. And that's how this is for me. Now it just seems so obvious. I can't imagine how I never knew this. But yeah, there was a time not that long ago that I didn't understand this. So what I'm talking about today is momentum and pacing in a book. So I've noticed in the books that I read that I really like, especially the books that I can't put down, that just really hook me, and I just end up reading far later than I intended to, because it's just so good and I'm so engrossed in the book and I'm so much wanting to know what happens next that I can't put it down. And anybody who reads books is familiar with this. You always hear people talk about not being able to put a book down. So I noticed that these books that are like this for me have something in common, and that's the way that they're paced and how they're paced. In that they start at whatever pace they start at the beginning, but then as the book goes on and as it draws closer and closer to the climax of the story, that pacing increases until the point we get to the climax, it's at its fastest pace. And then once the climax is resolved and we're in the resolution or the denouement, then it eases up again. So I noticed that all the books I really love that I can't put down have this element to their pacing. And I also noticed how it happens and how it's done. So I've noticed in these books that I really like, that I can't put down, that there's a lot more description and establishing of things, characters, setting, etc., and a lot more characters doing things that aren't directly related to the main plot in the earlier parts of the book. As the conflict then emerges in the story, there's less and less in this. So in the very beginning of the book, there's a lot of descriptions. There's a lot of establishing who these characters are, what makes them tick, establishing what the setting is like. If you're talking science fiction or fantasy, even if you're not, you still establish setting to some degree, even if you're talking just a commercial fiction or whatever. If you're talking science fiction or fantasy, part of establishing the setting is often establishing the technology or the magic of the setting. So there's a lot of this in the beginning of the book, and as we go through the book and get closer and closer to the climax, there's less and less of this. Instead, as we get closer to the climax, we focus more and more on action and dialogue. Once we're nearing the climax, pretty much everything has been established and described earlier in the book at this point, so there's no need to do it now. Now it's just dialogue and things happening. And there are no scenes that aren't directly moving the plot forward. This drives up the momentum of the story, and it keeps the reader turning the pages. Now, at this point, as a reader, when we're getting near the climax or we're in the climax, if there are too many descriptions, I tend to just skip them or skim them to get to the quote good stuff. And you've probably noticed this too as a reader. You know, you get to this really tense moment in the story, and maybe the writer starts describing all this stuff, and you're like, I don't care about this right now. And you skim through it or skip it to get to the next thing that happens next, because you got to know what happens next. So in the last half of the book, or at least the last half, not counting the resolution / denouement at the very end, there's for the most part only action and excitement. Now, I think part of this just happens naturally and organically. You know, if you are going to describe something, whether that's a character, a location, an object, etc., then the time to do that is the first time the reader encounters that thing in the book. So it stands to reason that this will most often happen in the earlier parts of the book. By the time you're halfway through the book, you've already met most, if not all, of the main characters, so they've already been described. Sure, you will encounter new things in the last half of the book, but most of the new things are encountered earlier. To me, I think the beginning of a book or story is kind of like the beginning of a relationship. You often want to take it slow in the beginning to get the most out of what comes next. The reader is getting to know the characters, the main character or characters, the antagonist, and other characters. The reader is also getting to know the setting. This is especially true in sci-fi and fantasy. And this all takes time. And this is the part of the book where you can not only get away with a more leisurely pace, but the reader will often appreciate that because they want to get to know these characters, they want to get to know the setting. So they're going to appreciate you taking the time to show them all that and being, more leisurely in your pace, as long as you keep things interesting. Again, it's a lot like a relationship. If you really like this person or story, and you really find this person or story interesting and fascinating, then you relish the chance to really get to know this person or story better. You want to learn all you can about them. And that's exciting. And there's a sense of discovery there that is very satisfying and keeps you wanting more. As a writer, you don't want to step on your own feet here by rushing ahead with the story. Give the reader time to get acquainted, to get comfortable, and then pull the rug out from under them. So like I said, I think some of this pacing, slower in the beginning and then picking up speed as we go into the rising action and approach the climax comes about naturally, without effort. But I think part of it is often a conscious choice on the part of the writer and how they choose to write different parts of the novel, different sections of the novel. It's a matter of pacing. As we get near the end of the rising action and approach the climax of a story, we want the pacing to speed up a bit, or even a lot. Or at the very least, we certainly don't want the pacing to slow down. So when you reach this part of the story, towards the end of the rising action, getting into the climax, it's only natural to limit descriptions only to those that are absolutely necessary and to keep those descriptions as short and tight as possible. The number and length of descriptions is only one element that contributes to pacing, though. Other very important elements are sentence length and paragraph length. As you're nearing the climax of the story and the writer is wanting to up the pace, you'll often see shorter sentences and shorter paragraphs. A fast-paced scene is a natural home for the one-word sentence, the one-sentence paragraph, and the one-word, one-sentence paragraph. And you'll see this, if you look at the books you read that are like this, that have this really great pacing, you'll see when you get into the climax, you'll see a lot more really short sentences and really short paragraphs and paragraphs that are only a single sentence, even only a single word. When this is done really well in a book, it often reminds me of a train getting started. If you've ever watched a train start from a full stop, then you know what I mean here. At first, the train is still, it's not moving. When it begins to move, it does so very slowly, just kind of creeping along. Hardly seems to be moving at all. But the train is constantly slowly gaining speed. It's also gaining acceleration, which is to say each second it ticks by, the rate at which its speed is growing is increasing as well. Honestly, an even better metaphor for this, though maybe not as familiar to everyone, especially for this show, is watching a rocket launch. It's the same idea. When the engines first fire, the rocket seems to be not moving at all. Then it seems to very slowly start climbing. As seconds tick by, it accelerates faster and faster. As a side note here, just an interesting tidbit, this is actually a trick of perception. I've heard astronauts talk about this and what it's like to be on a rocket when it launches. And they say that to them on the rocket, it's not like that at all. It feels like they're being shot out of a gun or a cannon. So there's instant, incredible acceleration. When you're watching a rocket launch or in the days of the space shuttle, watching the space shuttle launch, it looks like it's just barely going up at all in the beginning. But when you're on the thing, that's not what it feels like at all. It feels like you're being shot out of a cannon. So back to storytelling. A good book is like this. It starts at a slower, even a leisurely pace, but it continually builds momentum until it reaches the climax. Often the acceleration increases as you get closer to the climax, to add to the feeling of tension and to make the climax even more climactic. Once the climax is resolved, if you're going to have a denouement or resolution, then the pacing slows down again. You again have more room for description, and you'll often start seeing longer sentences and paragraphs again. So this could be compared to our train slowing down at the end of its journey, or a rocket reaching orbit, when the feeling of motion slows and then ultimately stops. You'll often see this kind of pacing in movies too. As far as books go, some of the best examples would probably be in the thrillers category, as they seem to leverage these techniques the most, but you can see this in pretty much any well-written novel. So as far as how we can approach this as writers, I think there are some key takeaways here. Number one, the best time for descriptions and establishing characters, setting, etc. is at the beginning of the book. Focus on most fully describing these elements the first time the reader encounters them in the story. 2, as you get further in the book, descriptions should start to taper off. This should mostly happen naturally, as the further you get in the book, the more things you've already described. So naturally, there are fewer things left to describe. Because again, you're describing everything the first time the reader encounters it. So the further you get in the book, the fewer things there are that the reader hasn't encountered yet. Not only should there be fewer and fewer descriptions as you approach the climax, but endeavor to make the descriptions that are necessary as concise as possible. So, in the beginning of the book, you can be a little more flowery with your descriptions or a little more, have more details and things like that. But as you get to the climax, you really want to keep them short and to the point and really as short as you can. Okay, number 3. By the time you reach the climax, ideally you've set things up so well that few or no descriptions are necessary at this point. Instead, you can focus on the action and the dialogue, what's happening, which is what the reader cares about at this point anyway. If you put too many descriptions and non-relevant seeming things in at this part of the book, you run a real risk of the reader skimming or skipping them, at which point, what's the point in putting it in there? If the reader isn't going to read it, why put it in there? It also annoys the reader and can suck out the tension of the climax if there's too much other crap in there. which is the last thing you probably want, right? You want the climax to be as climactic as possible. So the last thing you want to do is bleed off tension. All right, number 4, once you've passed the climax and you're in the denouement, then you can ease off the gas. You've got time for more descriptions again. And at this stage of the story, you're probably mostly describing things that have changed, things that are different now due to the consequences of what happened in the climax. And then number 5, sentence and paragraph length can be a contributing factor to this feeling of momentum. When you want things to be fast-paced, in other words, at the climax, use shorter sentences and paragraphs. When things are slower paced and you're giving the reader a breather, like at the beginning and the end of the book, you can use longer sentences and paragraphs. So I was really excited when all this kind of came to me a few months ago. And I think maybe it was while I was reading Project Hail Mary that I kind of had this revelation, but I'm not sure exactly which book I was reading when this came to me. But when I did, I thought about a lot of the books I'd read recently and all the ones I'd read recently that I really liked, and they all had these elements. They were all doing these things. And, I think pacing is really important. And I think sometimes it's not talked about enough or sometimes we don't focus on it enough. Because, if you read a lot of book reviews and not necessarily, reviews by professional reviewers, but just, reviews on Amazon or whatever of books, a lot of times when people are complaining about a book, that's what they're complaining about a lot of times is the pacing, is usually they're saying it's too slow. It takes too long for the story to get interesting, or the pacing is just too slow. It's not moving along fast enough for them. And there's definitely a thing of books being too slow in the beginning and not hooking you at the very beginning. But I think that tends to be more often a thing of not having a good hook, because I've found if a book really hooks me, I don't mind a slow pace at the beginning. In fact, like I said, I kind of like it as long as it's interesting, as long as I'm learning about characters I care about, or I'm learning about aspects of a setting that I think are really cool. As long as I'm hooked into that book and I'm interested in the story or what's going to happen, I'm fine with that. And I actually really like it in the beginning of the book. So, I don't know, but I suspect that a lot of times when people are complaining about the pacing in the beginning of a book and saying it's too slow or it takes too long to get interesting, the problem isn't so much the pacing, it's not hooking them. There's either not a good hook or the hook is too far into the book. It's not early enough in the book. And so there's just too much time where you're just not really invested in this book yet. But yeah, if I'm really intrigued with what's going on or I really like the characters, then I can handle a really slow pace in the beginning. Like Project Hail Mary, I was hooked on that book from the first page. And a lot of that book is the main character doing all kinds of problem solving that I could see in another context, some of it being pretty boring, but I was never bored with it because I was so interested in what was going on, and it was kind of presented as a mystery where we don't know what's going on and why this character's in the situation he's in. And we're discovering that with the character. And I was very interested in that. So even when there were these things happening that were just kind of problem solving and weren't in and of themselves terribly exciting or even interesting, I was still on board because I wanted to know what was happening and I wanted to figure out this mystery. And that's what the character was doing. It wasn't like unrelated problem solving. It was all stuff directly related to figuring out what was going on. So I was totally on board, even if maybe at times it was a little slowly paced, at least, in the beginning parts of the book. And there were even lots of flashbacks in that book, which I normally don't like. It normally feels like when you have a flashback, like you're not even in the story anymore and we could just skip this. But I never felt that way in that book. The flashbacks were always really interesting to me. Another example of a book I read recently, To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, that book, that was a really long book. I think the hardcover is like 800 pages or something. And there were definitely parts of that book that were pretty slowly paced. But by then, I was so invested in the main character that I didn't care. And the entire book was from one point of view. So I was always in the main character's head. So even when the pace was really slow, I was still on board because I was so into the character and wanting to learn more about her and see what she does next and stuff like that. So, it's interesting because, you read a lot of reviews, and a lot of times when people don't like a book, a very common complaint you see is the pacing. But I think that a lot of times when the problem is the pacing, that problem is in the climax. If you screw up the pacing of the climax and it's too slow and plotting during the climax, that's when you're really going to lose people. I think you can have slower pacing in the introduction and the rising action of the book, as long as you have a good hook and you have interesting characters that the reader cares about and what's going on is interesting. As long as you have those things and you have reader buy-in, then I think you can get away with a slower pace. But yeah, once you get to the climax, you got to speed things up. So yeah, I think pacing is something that some of us at least probably need to think about a little more. And I think if we think about what I talked about today, I mean, honestly, if you just do what's logical, I feel like it kind of takes care of itself. Like if you're fully describing things the first time the reader encounters them, then just by nature of that, by the time you get to the climax, you will have described 90% of the stuff anyway. And then you just got to remember that during the climax, anything new that comes along that you want to describe, just keep it as short and sweet as possible because you don't want to lose your momentum. And then think about adjusting your writing a bit in the climax and leaning more towards shorter sentences, shorter paragraphs, which isn't hard to do. And yeah, you're most of the way there already, I think. I'd love to hear what you think. If you have any other tips or ideas for people as far as how to approach momentum and pacing in their books, I'd love to hear your thoughts. You could email me at lexoutloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Twitter at LexStarWalker. And you can call my voicemail, 951-465-5391. Finally, you can join our community on Discord, and you can talk with myself and other listeners of the show and other writers. And, you can talk about this or any other topic that you like. We have a lot of fun in there, and I'm adding new rooms to the Discord all the time. So there's a lot of things we talk in there above and beyond just writing. So yeah, join us in the Discord. We'd love to see you there. Finally, if you'd like to help me out and support what I'm doing, you can check out my Audible trial. You can use my Amazon referral link when you shop on Amazon, and you can become a patron of the show. Really appreciate all the patrons. Really make this show possible. And patrons get early access to new episodes. They get access to some special patron-only rooms on the Discord and things like that. So you can check out all the ways to help me out and support the show at lexstarwalker.com/support. And all of those links for all the contact stuff you can find in the show notes for this or any of the episodes at lexstarwalker.com/LOL. So I hope that you have a great week. And yeah, I hope this was helpful to you in thinking about how to approach pacing in your books and how to keep that momentum going forward, taking us through the climax of the story. I'll be back soon with another episode. And actually, next episode 46, is going to be the season 2 finale episode for Lex Out Loud. Looking forward to that. And then that will wrap up season 2 of the show. It's kind of nice how it worked out. Season 1 was a lot about world building, as I was world building for this novel then. And then during season 2, I've been writing the first draft of the novel. And I am still on track to finish that by the end of this year. In fact, I think I will have it done by the beginning of December, if not before. And so when I begin season 3, which I'm going to take a little time off over the holidays and the end of the year and whatnot, but season 3 will probably be coming out sometime in January of 2022. And by then, I will be working on a new book. And then I think in February or March, depending on when I finish the first draft, I will begin editing this book I'm working on right now. So yeah, February, March will be fun because I'll be writing the first draft of a new book. I'll start editing this book that I'm working on right now. And then what I'm really excited about next year is once I get this book I'm writing now edited and polished as well as I can, I'm going to start looking for agents. So yeah, season 3 will probably once again kind of shift in focus as I shift in my focus of what I'm doing. So it's kind of cool how that just kind of worked out that way. So yeah, I'm looking forward to coming back in season 3, but yeah, we'll have another episode, next episode 46 for this season. And yeah, then we'll be off for a few weeks. So yeah, I wish you luck in all of your writing endeavors. And until next time, keep writing.